Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from the remote hollows of Appalachia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1897 had settled over the rugged terrain of Braxton County, West Virginia, with an unusual stillness that seemed to press down upon the isolated homesteads scattered throughout the hollow, known locally as Widow's Gap. Named for the peculiar geological formation that created a narrow passage between two towering ridges, the gap had earned its ominous moniker decades earlier, when a succession of women had found themselves alone in the remote settlement, their husbands claimed by mining accidents, logging mishaps, or simply the harsh realities of frontier life. At the heart of this desolate community stood a two-story timber frame house that would become the center of one of the most perplexing disappearances in Appalachian history. The structure, built in 1873 by a prosperous timber merchant named Cornelius Hathorne, occupied a peculiar position on a natural shelf of rock approximately halfway up the eastern slope of the gap. From a distance, the house appeared to perch precariously on the mountainside, its dark, weathered boards blending with the shadows cast by the towering hemlocks that surrounded it. The house itself was an anomaly in the region, constructed with materials and craftsmanship that spoke to considerable financial investment. Unlike the typical log cabins and rough-hewn dwellings that dotted the Appalachian landscape, the Hathorne residence featured milled lumber, glass windows with decorative frames, and a wraparound porch supported by turned columns. The basement, carved directly into the living rock of the mountainside, extended much deeper than was customary for rural construction of that era. Local workers who had participated in its construction often commented on the unusual specifications demanded by Cornelius, particularly his insistence on multiple levels of cellars and storage areas that seemed excessive for a family residence. The property had come into the possession of Cordelia Hathorne following her husband's death in a sawmill accident in 1895. At 43 years of age, Cordelia found herself the sole inhabitant of the isolated dwelling, with the nearest neighbor nearly 2 miles away down a treacherous mountain path that became impassable during winter months. Local records from the Braxton County Courthouse indicate that she maintained the property through a small inheritance and occasional sales of ginseng and other mountain herbs to traveling merchants. Cordelia's background before her marriage to Cornelius remained largely mysterious to the local community. She had arrived in Braxton County in 1881, claiming to be the widow of a physician who had died in a yellow fever epidemic in New Orleans. Her education was evident in her speech and manner, setting her apart from most frontier women of the era. She possessed an extensive collection of medical texts and scientific publications, unusual possessions for someone living in such isolation. These books, according to inventory records preserved after her disappearance, included anatomical atlases, surgical manuals, and treatises on experimental medicine that seemed incongruous with her stated background as a physician's widow. According to the sparse documentation available from that period, Cordelia Hathorne was described by those who knew her as a woman of stern demeanor and few words. The Reverend Matthias Stern of the Burnsville Methodist Church, in his personal journals preserved at the West Virginia Historical Society, noted that she attended services only sporadically and always sat alone in the rear pew, departing immediately after the closing hymn without engaging in the customary social exchange that followed worship. His observations of her behavior became increasingly detailed over time, suggesting a growing concern about her psychological state. In an entry dated June 12, 1896, Reverend Stern wrote, "Mrs. Hathorne's appearance continues to cause me consternation. Her weight has diminished noticeably since her husband's passing, and her complexion has taken on an unhealthy pallor. More troubling is her habit of staring fixedly at various members of the congregation during services. studying them with an intensity that borders on the unseemly. When approached after today's service with offers of assistance or companionship, she responded only that she had important work that required her full attention. When pressed for details about this work, she merely smiled in a manner that I found deeply unsettling and departed without further explanation. The isolation that defined Cordelia's existence was not merely geographical. Her late husband's business associates had gradually ceased their visits following his death, and the steady stream of timber crews that had once frequented the house for meals and lodging disappeared as logging operations moved to more accessible areas. By the winter of 1896, Cordelia's only regular human contact came through the monthly visits of Jedediah Morse, a circuit rider who delivered mail and supplies to the scattered homesteads throughout the region. Morse's detailed records, maintained as part of his official duties and preserved in the archives of the Pocahontas County Historical Society, provide valuable insights into Cordelia's gradual transformation during this period. His route covered approximately 47 homesteads scattered across 3 counties, and his meticulous documentation of supply requests, payment schedules, and notable observations created an inadvertent record of rural life that historians have found invaluable. His entries regarding the Hathorne property began to reflect growing unease as early as February 1897. It was Morse who first documented the unusual changes that began to manifest around the Hathorne property in early 1897. In his detailed log of route conditions and notable occurrences, he recorded an entry dated March 15, 1897, that would prove prophetic. Mrs. Hathorne's demeanor has grown increasingly peculiar during recent visits. She receives her monthly supplies at the gate rather than inviting me to the house, as has been her custom. When questioned about her health, she responds only that the walls have grown thin and that she can hear too much. Waked. Her appearance suggests poor sleep and inadequate nourishment. More concerning are the unusual odors that emanate from the property, particularly from the area around the house's foundation. The smell is reminiscent of a medical facility or laboratory, with sharp chemical scents mixed with something organic and unpleasant. The supply requests that Cordelia submitted through Morse became increasingly exotic and puzzling over the course of 1897. His records show orders for chemical compounds typically used in preservation and anatomical study, including large quantities of formaldehyde, carbolic acid, and various mineral salts. She also requested medical instruments, surgical tools, and anatomical texts that seemed excessive for someone claiming to practice herbal medicine. When Morse questioned the necessity of these items, Cordelia explained that she was conducting research into natural preservation methods and anatomical studies for medicinal purposes. The geographical isolation of Widow's Gap created ideal conditions for the preservation of secrets. The settlement's position, nestled between 2 ridges that rose nearly 800 feet above the narrow valley floor, created a natural sound trap that amplified even minor disturbances while simultaneously concealing them from the outside world. Local folklore, documented in a 1934 Works Progress Administration interview with longtime resident Zephaniah Cutler, suggested that the acoustic properties of the Gap had long been recognized by the area's original Cherokee inhabitants, who considered it a place where words spoken in anger would return threefold. The Cherokee connection to the area proved more significant than initially understood. Archaeological evidence discovered in 1923 during a state geological survey revealed that Widow's Gap had been the site of seasonal encampments for several centuries before European settlement. More intriguingly, the survey uncovered evidence of deliberate modifications to the natural cave systems that honeycomb the limestone substrate of the region. These modifications appeared to be of considerable antiquity, predating European settlement by several generations, and their purpose remained unclear to the archaeologists who studied them. Dr. Fitzhugh Morrison, the lead archaeologist on the 1923 survey, noted in his report that the cave modifications followed a systematic pattern that suggested sophisticated engineering knowledge. Artificial chambers had been carved from the living rock, connected by precisely dimensioned tunnels that maintained consistent grade and ventilation. Most puzzling was evidence that the cave system extended far beyond the natural limestone formations, with tunnels that appeared to burrow directly through solid granite in defiance of practical construction methods. Morrison's team abandoned their survey before completing a full mapping of the system, citing safety concerns and equipment failures. During the summer of 1897, several of the remaining families in the hollow began to report unusual sounds emanating from the direction of the Hathorne property, particularly during the pre-dawn hours. Martha Pennington, who resided with her family approximately a mile and a half southeast of Cordelia's house, provided a detailed account to the county sheriff in September 1897. According to her statement preserved in the Braxton County Sheriff's Department records, she had been awakened on multiple occasions by what she described as a rhythmic striking sound, like someone driving fence posts, but continuing for hours without pause. The Pennington family's farmstead occupied a natural terrace overlooking the lower reaches of Widow's Gap, providing them with an unobstructed view of the Hathorne property during daylight hours. Martha's husband, Josiah, supplemented his farming income by operating a small grist mill powered by a mountain stream, necessitating his presence at the mill during early morning hours, when grain deliveries typically arrived. His vantage point from the mill site allowed him to observe the Hathorne property during periods when unusual activity was most frequently reported. Josiah's statement to authorities, filed separately from his wife's account, provided additional disturbing details about the activities they had witnessed. The sounds began before dawn, usually around 3 or 4 in the morning, he reported. They consisted of regular striking sounds, as if someone were using a heavy hammer or maul, but the rhythm was too steady and prolonged for any normal construction work. Sometimes these sounds would continue for 5 or 6 hours without interruption. During daylight, I could see smoke rising from the chimney of the main house, but also from other locations around the property where no buildings should have been present. The Pennington family's observations were corroborated by similar reports from Elias Bramwell, whose homestead occupied the lower reaches of the gap near the main road to Burnsville. Bramwell's written testimony, submitted to local authorities in October 1897, described sounds of construction or demolition continuing through the night, and noted that his hunting dogs refused to venture in the direction of the Hathorne property, exhibiting signs of extreme agitation whenever they were encouraged to do so. Bramwell's account included details that suggested the scope of activity around the Hathorne property was far greater than what could be accomplished by a single individual. He reported seeing lights moving through the forest at night, following what appeared to be established paths or roadways, though no such routes were visible during daylight hours. These lights were not the steady glow of lanterns carried by travelers, but rather appeared to move in systematic patterns that suggested organized activity. On several occasions, Bramwell counted as many as 6 or 7 separate light sources moving simultaneously through the woods surrounding the Hathorne house. The mystery deepened when Bramwell attempted to investigate these nocturnal activities more closely. His testimony describes approaching the Hathorne property on foot during one of these episodes, guided by the sounds and lights that had become a nightly disturbance. However, as he drew nearer to the source of the activity, the sounds ceased abruptly, and the lights disappeared. When he reached the area where the activity had been centered, he found no evidence of recent work or human presence. The ground showed no signs of disturbance, and the forest was silent except for the normal sounds of nocturnal wildlife. More disturbing was Bramwell's report that his approach had apparently been detected by whoever was responsible for the activity, despite his efforts to move quietly through the forest. As he stood in the empty clearing where moments before there had been signs of intensive work, he became aware of being observed. Though he could see nothing in the darkness, he experienced the unmistakable sensation of multiple pairs of eyes watching him from the surrounding forest. The feeling was so intense and unsettling that he abandoned his investigation and returned home as quickly as the treacherous terrain would allow. The first indication that something had gone seriously amiss came on November 3, 1897, when Jedediah Morse arrived for his monthly supply delivery and found the property apparently deserted. His account, documented in both his personal log and an official statement to the Braxton County Sheriff, describes approaching the house and calling for Mrs. Hathorne without receiving any response. The front door stood slightly ajar, unusual for someone who had become increasingly security conscious in recent months. Morse's investigation of the property revealed several disturbing details that went beyond the simple absence of the homeowner. The interior of the house appeared to be in perfect order, with no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Cordelia's personal belongings remained in their customary places, including a purse containing a substantial sum of money left openly on the kitchen table. More puzzling was the presence of a meal that appeared to have been interrupted mid-consumption. A plate of partially eaten food sat at the dining table, with utensils positioned as if the diner had simply paused and never returned. The condition of the interrupted meal suggested that whatever had caused Cordelia's departure had occurred suddenly, without warning or opportunity for preparation. The food showed signs of having been abandoned for several days, though decomposition was limited by the cool temperature maintained within the house. More intriguingly, the meal consisted of items that were not present in the house's pantry or root cellar, suggesting that Cordelia had been expecting company or had prepared food for someone other than herself. The most unsettling discovery occurred when Morse investigated the source of an unusual odor that permeated the house. Following the scent to the cellar, he found that the earthen floor had been disturbed over a considerable area. Fresh excavation was evident, but rather than the random pattern one might expect from root cellar improvements or foundation repairs, the digging followed a deliberate geometric pattern that suggested purpose and planning. The displaced earth had been neatly piled in the corners of the cellar, and the excavated areas had been refilled and carefully tamped down. The cellar modifications revealed a level of engineering sophistication that seemed inconsistent with Cordelia's apparent resources and physical capabilities. The excavated areas connected to form a network of underground chambers and passages that extended far beyond the footprint of the house above. Some of these passages appeared to connect with natural cave formations in the underlying limestone, while others had been carved directly through solid rock using methods that would have required considerable expertise and specialized tools. When questioned by Sheriff Horatio Kelm during the subsequent investigation, Morse was unable to provide a satisfactory explanation for the cellar's condition. It appeared as though Mrs. Hathorne had been engaged in some manner of systematic excavation, he stated in his sworn deposition. The work was too extensive and purposeful to have been accomplished quickly, and certainly not by one person working alone. Yet I cannot fathom what would have compelled such an undertaking, particularly for a woman of her age and physical constitution. Morse's testimony also included details about modifications he had observed to the house's structure during previous visits, changes that had been gradual enough to escape immediate attention, but which in retrospect suggested long-term planning and purpose. Interior walls had been relocated to create larger open spaces, particularly in the basement areas. Additional windows had been installed in locations that provided no apparent benefit in terms of light or ventilation, but which might serve as observation points for monitoring the surrounding forest. Most significantly, several rooms had been fitted with what appeared to be laboratory equipment, including chemical apparatus, preservation tanks, and instrument cabinets that seemed more appropriate to a medical facility than a rural residence. The official investigation into Cordelia Hathorn's disappearance was hampered by several factors, not least of which was the approaching winter weather that made travel to the remote location increasingly treacherous. Sheriff Kelm, accompanied by 2 deputies, conducted a thorough search of the property on November 8, 1897, but found no additional evidence beyond what Morse had already documented. The sheriff's report, filed with the circuit court, noted that, while circumstances surrounding Mrs. Hathorn's absence are highly irregular, no evidence of foul play has been established. Sheriff Kelm's investigation was also constrained by jurisdictional limitations and resource shortages that plagued rural law enforcement in the late 19th century. His department consisted of himself and 3 deputies responsible for maintaining order across nearly 500 square miles of challenging terrain. The remote location of the Hathorn property, accessible only by foot or horseback over mountain trails, made sustained investigation logistically difficult and expensive. Political pressure from county commissioners to minimize costs associated with what appeared to be a simple missing persons case further limited the scope and duration of the official inquiry. The investigation was further complicated by the discovery of a partially burned collection of papers in the house's main fireplace. The charred remains appeared to be personal correspondence and possibly medical or scientific notes, but the extent of the fire damage made reconstruction impossible. Sheriff Kelm noted in his report that the deliberate destruction of these documents suggests premeditation on Mrs. Hathorn's part, though the motivation for such action remains unclear. Chemical analysis of the ash residue, conducted years later by state investigators, revealed traces of compounds consistent with medical and scientific documentation. The papers appeared to have been burned with accelerants that ensured complete destruction, suggesting that their contents were considered sensitive enough to warrant such thorough elimination. Microscopic examination of surviving paper fragments revealed handwriting in multiple languages, including Latin medical terminology and what appeared to be correspondence in French and German, indicating connections to academic or professional networks beyond the local community. Local speculation about Cordelia's fate centered on several theories, none entirely satisfactory. Some suggested she had departed voluntarily to live with relatives in more distant parts of the state, though no such relatives were ever identified despite extensive inquiries. Others proposed that she had fallen victim to one of the vagrant men who occasionally passed through the region, though the lack of disturbance in the house and the presence of valuable items argued against this possibility. A persistent minority held that she had taken her own life in response to the isolation and hardship of her circumstances, though no body was ever recovered despite extensive searches of the surrounding terrain. The truth might have remained forever buried were it not for a curious discovery made in the spring of 1898. Hiram Blackstone, a ginseng harvester, working the slopes above Widow's Gap, noticed an unusual depression in the forest floor approximately half a mile northwest of the Hathorn property. Investigation revealed that the depression was not natural, but rather the result of ground settlement over what appeared to be an artificial excavation. Blackstone's discovery took on greater significance when viewed in the context of his extensive knowledge of the local terrain. As a professional ginseng harvester, he had spent decades exploring every accessible acre of the mountain slopes, developing an intimate familiarity with natural landmarks and seasonal changes in the forest floor. The depression that caught his attention was located in an area he had traversed hundreds of times over the years, making its sudden appearance all the more remarkable. The location of the depression also corresponded to one of the areas where Elias Bramwell had reported seeing mysterious lights during the previous year. Blackstone's detailed description of the site matched closely with Bramwell's account of a clearing where nocturnal activity had been observed, but where no evidence remained during daylight investigation. This correlation suggested that the depression might be connected to the activities that had preceded Cordelia's disappearance. Blackstone's report to the authorities led to a second investigation conducted in May 1898 under the supervision of Detective Aldrich Pemberton from the state capitol. Pemberton brought with him specialized equipment and expertise that had been lacking in the initial county-level investigation. The excavation revealed disturbing evidence that cast Cordelia Hathorn's disappearance in an entirely different light, transforming a simple missing persons case into something far more sinister. The excavation uncovered what appeared to be a sophisticated underground laboratory or workshop that had been deliberately concealed and buried. The facility consisted of multiple chambers carved directly from the bedrock and connected by a network of tunnels that extended in several directions. The construction showed evidence of considerable planning and expertise, with properly engineered ventilation systems, drainage, and structural supports that would have required knowledge of mining or engineering techniques. Buried at a depth of approximately 6 feet were the remains of what appeared to be a makeshift workshop or laboratory, partially preserved wooden tables, glass apparatus, and an assortment of tools suggested that someone had been engaged in activities that required both secrecy and considerable technical knowledge. The preservation of organic materials was remarkably good, aided by the controlled environment created by the underground location and the clay soil that had sealed the chambers from moisture and air circulation. More disturbing were the organic remains found at the site. While decomposition had rendered precise identification impossible, the assemblage included bone fragments that were clearly not of animal origin, along with fabric remnants that suggested the presence of human clothing. The detective's report, classified and sealed for reasons that were never made public, concluded that the evidence suggests activities of a nature incompatible with civilized society, conducted over an extended period by an individual possessed of considerable knowledge and determination. The bone fragments discovered in the buried laboratory showed evidence of deliberate modification that suggested they had been subjects of anatomical study or experimentation. Cut marks on several specimens indicated the use of surgical instruments, while other bones showed signs of chemical treatment that was consistent with preservation or preparation for long-term storage. The overall assemblage suggested that multiple individuals had been processed through the facility, though the exact number could not be determined due to the fragmentary nature of the remains. Chemical analysis of soil samples from the laboratory site revealed elevated levels of preservatives, acids, and metallic compounds that were consistent with anatomical preparation and long-term specimen storage. The concentration of these chemicals indicated that the site had been used extensively over a considerable period, possibly spanning several years. The chemical signature also matched residues found in the basement of the Hathorn house, establishing a clear connection between the two locations. The connection between this buried workshop and Cordelia Hathorn's disappearance might never have been established were it not for the testimony of Jedediah Morse, who, when shown certain artifacts recovered from the site, identified them as items he had delivered to the Hathorn property over the course of several months. His supply orders, he revealed, had included unusual requests for chemical compounds, anatomical texts, and surgical instruments that seemed incongruous with the needs of a rural widow. Morse's recognition of the artifacts led to a comprehensive review of his delivery records, which revealed a disturbing pattern of increasingly specialized requests that suggested systematic preparation for the activities discovered at the underground site. The timeline of these requests correlated closely with the reports of unusual nighttime activity around the Hathorn property, indicating that the laboratory construction and Cordelia's supply acquisitions were part of a coordinated plan that had been developing for months before its discovery. Mrs. Hathorn claimed to be pursuing herbal remedies for her own ailments, Morse testified during a closed hearing in June 1898. I found her requests unusual. but attributed them to the eccentricities one might expect from someone living in such isolation. She paid promptly and in cash, so I saw no reason to question her motives. Now, in light of these discoveries, I must acknowledge that her true purposes were far darker than I could have imagined. The investigation revealed that Cordelia had been conducting what could only be described as anatomical experiments in the buried laboratory. Journal fragments recovered from the site, though heavily damaged by moisture and decomposition, contained detailed notes on human anatomy and references to the necessity of understanding the vessel before the transformation can be completed. The handwriting was confirmed as Cordelia's by comparison with documents from the courthouse records, establishing her direct involvement in the activities conducted at the site. The journal fragments provided disturbing insights into Cordelia's motivations and methods. Her notes suggested that she was attempting to develop techniques for what she termed anatomical optimization, procedures designed to modify human physical structure in ways that would enhance function or appearance. The scientific basis for these theories appeared to be derived from a combination of legitimate medical knowledge and speculative theories that had no foundation in accepted scientific practice. More disturbing were references in the journal fragments to subjects and preparations. While the damaged condition of the documents made complete reconstruction impossible, the surviving text suggested that Cordelia had been practicing some form of medical or scientific procedure on unwilling participants. The clinical tone of her notes, combined with detailed descriptions of surgical techniques and post-mortem examination procedures, indicated a level of systematic documentation that suggested these activities were part of an ongoing research program rather than isolated incidents. The source of these subjects became a matter of intense speculation, as no missing persons reports from the surrounding area could account for the biological remains found at the site. The fragmented nature of the remains and the evidence of chemical processing made identification of individual victims impossible, but the volume of material suggested that multiple persons had been processed through the laboratory over an extended period. The answer came from an unexpected source. In August 1898, a traveling merchant named Silas Crenshaw contacted authorities with information about several men who had sought directions to the Hathorne property over the previous 2 years. According to Crenshaw's statement, these individuals were typically solitary travelers, often appearing to be down on their luck and seeking temporary work or shelter. He had routinely directed such men toward Widow's Gap, knowing that isolated homesteads sometimes offered opportunities for day labor in exchange for meals and temporary lodging. Crenshaw's testimony provided crucial links between the physical evidence discovered at the laboratory site and the practical means by which Cordelia had acquired subjects for her experiments. His detailed descriptions of the men he had directed toward the Hathorne property matched closely with personal effects and clothing remnants recovered from the underground facility. The systematic nature of these referrals suggested that Cordelia had deliberately established a network for attracting potential victims to her remote location. They were men no one would miss, Crenshaw admitted during his interview with investigators, drifters and vagrants who rarely stayed in any location long enough to form connections. I thought I was doing them a kindness by directing them toward a place where Christian charity might provide them with sustenance and shelter. I never imagined that I was sending them to their doom. Crenshaw's role in facilitating Cordelia's crimes raised troubling questions about the broader network that had enabled her activities to continue undetected. His regular routes through the region put him in contact with dozens of transient workers, seasonal laborers, and displaced persons who traveled the mountain roads in search of employment or shelter. His informal role as a source of information about work opportunities and accommodations made him an unwitting facilitator of Cordelia's victim selection process. The investigation of Crenshaw's activities revealed that he had maintained detailed records of his encounters with travelers, including names, destinations, and general descriptions of the individuals he had assisted. These records, spanning several years, provided investigators with a comprehensive list of potential victims and established a timeline for Cordelia's activities that extended much further back than previously suspected. The revelation that Cordelia had been deliberately targeting transient men transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into something far more sinister. Evidence suggested that she had been luring these vulnerable individuals to her remote property, where they became subjects for her grotesque experiments. The isolation of Widow's Gap meant that their disappearances went unnoticed and unreported, creating the perfect environment for her activities to continue undetected. Analysis of the evidence suggested that Cordelia's method of operation had become increasingly sophisticated over time. Early victims appeared to have been killed quickly, possibly by poison or other means that left minimal physical evidence. Later cases showed signs of more elaborate procedures that suggested the victims had been kept alive for extended periods while undergoing various forms of experimentation. The evolution of her techniques indicated a learning process that had been refined through practical experience. The question of what had ultimately happened to Cordelia herself remained unanswered until November 1898, exactly 1 year after her disappearance was first reported. A hunting party exploring the deeper reaches of Widow's Gap discovered what appeared to be the remains of a cave-in in a natural limestone cavity, approximately 3/4 of a mile from the Hathorne property. Excavation revealed that the collapse had been deliberately triggered, sealing the cave entrance and trapping whatever lay within. The cave system where Cordelia's final laboratory was discovered represented the most sophisticated of her underground facilities. Unlike the buried workshop that had been revealed by ground settlement, this natural cave had been extensively modified and expanded to create a complex that rivaled anything that might be found in a major medical institution. The engineering required for these modifications was far beyond what could be reasonably attributed to a single individual working alone, suggesting that Cordelia had access to skilled assistance or specialized knowledge that enabled her to undertake such ambitious construction projects. Recovery efforts, hampered by the unstable condition of the cave system, eventually yielded the skeletal remains of a single individual, along with evidence that the cave had been used as an extension of Cordelia's underground laboratory. More sophisticated equipment was present at this location, including apparatus that suggested experimentation with chemical preservation, surgical modification, and what appeared to be attempts at anatomical reconstruction or enhancement. The cave laboratory contained equipment and materials that were far more advanced than anything found at the previous site. Precision surgical instruments, complex chemical apparatus, and an extensive library of medical and scientific texts indicated that Cordelia's final phase of activity had reached a level of sophistication that approached that of a legitimate research facility. The presence of equipment that would have been extremely expensive and difficult to obtain suggested access to financial resources or professional networks that had not been previously suspected. More disturbing was evidence that the cave laboratory had been designed for long-term occupancy. Living quarters, food storage areas, and waste disposal systems indicated that Cordelia had intended to conduct extended periods of work without returning to the surface. The scale of the preparations suggested that she was planning for activities that would require weeks or months of uninterrupted work, possibly involving multiple subjects or complex procedures that could not be completed quickly. The documents recovered from the cave, though damaged by moisture and the cave-in, revealed that Cordelia had been pursuing what she termed anatomical transformation. Her notes described elaborate procedures designed to reshape the human form according to natural principles and referenced the necessity of multiple trials before perfection can be achieved. The skeletal remains found in the cave showed evidence of post-mortem modification, with bones that had been deliberately altered or repositioned in anatomically impossible configurations. The anatomical modifications evident in the skeletal remains defied conventional medical understanding and suggested that Cordelia had developed techniques that had no basis in legitimate scientific practice. Bones had been surgically cut, repositioned, and fused in configurations that would have been impossible in a living subject. The precision of these modifications indicated considerable skill and knowledge, but the purposes they were intended to serve remained unclear and possibly incomprehensible to rational analysis. More disturbing was evidence that Cordelia had been experimenting on herself. Medical examination of her remains revealed that she had performed multiple surgical procedures on her own body, apparently as part of her research into human modification. The condition of her skeleton suggested that these self-experiments had become increasingly radical and ultimately fatal, progressing from minor modifications to major structural alterations that were incompatible with continued life. The evidence of self-experimentation raised troubling questions about Cordelia's mental state during her final period of activity. Her willingness to subject herself to the same procedures she had inflicted on her victims suggested a level of obsession that had transcended normal considerations of self-preservation. The progression of these self-modifications, documented in her notes and evident in the physical remains, indicated a gradual abandonment of rational thought in favor of increasingly extreme theories about human anatomical enhancement. The final piece of the puzzle came from a journal entry dated October 29, 1897, just days before her disappearance was discovered. In this final entry, Cordelia wrote, "The work approaches completion, though the cost has been greater than anticipated. The subjects have provided valuable data, but the ultimate test must be performed upon the experimenter herself. If my theories prove correct, transformation will be achieved. If not, at least the evidence of failure will be properly concealed." This entry indicated that Cordelia had deliberately triggered the cave-in as a means of concealing her activities while simultaneously conducting what she apparently viewed as the culmination of her research. Her willingness to sacrifice her own life in pursuit of her grotesque goals suggested a level of obsession that had transcended normal human motivations and entered territory that defied rational analysis. The investigation concluded in December 1898 with the classification of Cordelia Hathorne as both perpetrator and victim of what authorities termed crimes against nature and human dignity. The official records were sealed, and the case was closed without public disclosure of the complete findings. Local residents were informed only that Mrs. Hathorne had perished in an accidental cave-in and that her property would be seized by the county for unpaid taxes. The decision to conceal the full details of the case reflected broader concerns about the impact that public disclosure might have on the region's reputation and economic development. Local officials feared that sensational accounts of the crimes might discourage settlement and investment in an area that was already struggling with the challenges of geographic isolation and limited economic opportunities. The sealed records were classified with the understanding that they would remain closed indefinitely, protecting both the victim's privacy and the community's interests. The Hathorne property stood empty for several years following the conclusion of the investigation. Local superstition, fed by rumors about unusual sounds and sightings in the area, discouraged potential buyers despite the relatively low asking price. The house itself began to deteriorate rapidly without maintenance, and the forest gradually began to reclaim the cleared areas around the building. It was not until 1903 that the property was purchased by a mining company that intended to use the house as quarters for survey crews working in the region. The company's plans were based on geological surveys that suggested the presence of coal deposits in the area, and the isolated location of the Haythorne property made it an ideal base for extended exploration activities. The mining company's plans were abandoned after a series of unsettling incidents involving their workers. According to company records preserved in the West Virginia Department of Mines archives, survey crews reported finding evidence of previous excavation throughout the area surrounding the house. More troubling were discoveries of bone fragments and metallic objects that appeared to be of recent origin, despite the property's supposed abandonment. The survey crew's reports described finding human remains in multiple locations throughout the property, often in circumstances that suggested deliberate burial or concealment. The remains were typically fragmentary and showed evidence of chemical treatment or surgical modification, consistent with the activities that had been discovered during the official investigation. However, the locations of these discoveries extended far beyond the areas that had been previously searched, suggesting that Cordelia's activities had encompassed a much larger area than investigators had realized. More disturbing were reports of equipment and apparatus found buried in various locations around the property. These items included surgical instruments, chemical containers, and mechanical devices that appeared to be related to anatomical experimentation. The presence of these materials in locations distant from the known laboratory sites suggested that Cordelia's activities had involved multiple work areas and possibly extended over a much longer period than previously suspected. The final attempt to utilize the property came in 1907, when a timber company purchased the land with intentions of using the house as a logging camp headquarters. This effort was also short-lived, abandoned after workers reported persistent equipment failures and the discovery of what were described as anatomical specimens in various locations throughout the property. The timber company's experience proved to be the most extensively documented of the post-investigation attempts to use the property. Company records include detailed reports of the discoveries that led to the abandonment of their operations, providing insights into the lasting impact of Cordelia's activities on the physical environment of the site. Workers reported finding preserved human tissue and bone fragments in locations throughout the forest surrounding the house. These remains were often discovered during routine logging activities, buried at shallow depths or concealed in natural cavities in the rock formations. The preservation of these materials was remarkable, suggesting that they had been treated with chemicals that prevented normal decomposition processes. The company's foreman, in a report to his supervisors, wrote, "The men refuse to work the site. They claim the ground itself is poisoned, and I am inclined to agree. Whatever happened in this place has left it unfit for human habitation. The very soil seems contaminated with the evidence of unnatural practices, and no amount of financial compensation can overcome the workers' revulsion at continuing operations in such an environment." The property was finally abandoned permanently in 1908, and the house was left to deteriorate naturally. Forest growth gradually reclaimed the clearing, and within a decade the structure had become nearly invisible from the main road. Local residents developed the custom of avoiding the area entirely, creating alternate routes for hunting and travel that bypassed Widow's Gap altogether. The case might have faded entirely from memory were it not for the research efforts of Dr. Bartholomew Ashford, a professor of criminology at West Virginia University, who became interested in historical crime patterns in rural Appalachia. In 1961, while conducting research for a book on frontier justice, Dr. Ashford discovered references to the Cordelia Hathorne case in sealed court records that had been transferred to the university's archives. Dr. Ashford's investigation, conducted over a period of 3 years, involved extensive interviews with elderly residents who had been alive during the time of the original events. His research revealed details that had been omitted from the official records, including the discovery of additional buried sites throughout the Widow's Gap area and evidence that Cordelia's activities had been far more extensive than initially suspected. Dr. Ashford's methodology involved the systematic collection of oral histories from individuals whose families had lived in the region during the relevant period. Many of these accounts contained details that had never been reported to authorities, either because the witnesses feared involvement in the investigation or because they doubted that their testimony would be believed. The accumulated evidence from these interviews painted a picture of criminal activity that was far more extensive and systematic than the official records suggested. One of Dr. Ashford's most significant findings came from his interview with Ezekiel Cutler, grandson of longtime local resident Zephaniah Cutler. According to family oral tradition preserved by Ezekiel, his grandfather had occasionally hunted in the area around the Hathorne property and had noticed increasing numbers of unmarked graves in the forest. Granddaddy used to say that woman was planting more than just vegetables in her garden, Ezekiel told Dr. Ashford in 1963. He counted at least a dozen mounds that hadn't been there before she moved in, all in places where a body might rest undisturbed. The oral history accounts collected by Dr. Ashford also revealed information about Cordelia's network of associates and accomplices. Several witnesses described seeing unfamiliar men visiting the Hathorne property, particularly during the months preceding her disappearance. These visitors were typically described as well-dressed individuals who appeared to be educated professionals, quite different from the transient workers who had been identified as Cordelia's primary victims. The presence of professional visitors at the Hathorne property suggested that Cordelia's activities may have been connected to broader networks of similar research or experimentation. References in her recovered notes to corresponding practitioners and shared methodologies supported this possibility, though no concrete evidence of such connections was ever definitively established. Dr. Ashford's attempts to verify these claims through archaeological investigation were frustrated by the changed conditions of the site. 6 decades of natural growth had obscured most surface evidence, and the West Virginia Department of Natural Resources denied permission for excavation on what had become protected forest land. His research was also hampered by the mysterious disappearance of several key documents from both university and county archives. The missing documents included the complete detective report from 1898, the sealed court records from the closed hearing, and most significantly, the journal fragments recovered from Cordelia's cave laboratory. Dr. Ashford noted in his research files that these disappearances appeared to be deliberate rather than accidental, suggesting that someone wishes to prevent full disclosure of the case details. The pattern of missing documents extended beyond the primary investigation records to include related materials such as property transfer records, tax assessments, and even church attendance rolls that might have provided additional insights into Cordelia's activities and associates. The systematic nature of these disappearances suggested a coordinated effort to suppress information about the case, though the motivations and responsible parties remained unidentified. Dr. Ashford's investigation came to an abrupt end in 1964 when he suffered what was officially described as a nervous breakdown following a solo visit to the Widow's Gap area. According to medical records from the West Virginia University Hospital, he was found 3 days after his planned return date, wandering in a confused state approximately 5 miles from the former Hathorne property. He exhibited symptoms of severe psychological trauma and was unable to provide a coherent account of his experiences during the missing time period. The circumstances of Dr. Ashford's breakdown were particularly puzzling, given his previous stability and professional competence. Colleagues described him as a methodical researcher who took appropriate precautions during field work and who had never shown signs of psychological instability. His sudden collapse following the Widow's Gap visit suggested that he had encountered something during his research that had exceeded his ability to process or rationalize. Upon his recovery, Dr. Ashford refused to discuss his research or his experiences at Widow's Gap. He transferred to a different department at the university and abandoned his criminology studies entirely. His research files were donated to the university library with the stipulation that they remain sealed until 1999. When the files were finally opened, they were found to contain only basic biographical information about Cordelia Hathorne and copies of publicly available documents. All of his original research notes and interview transcripts had vanished. The fate of the physical site continued to reflect the disturbing legacy of the case. In 1969, a state geological survey team conducting routine environmental assessments discovered evidence of extensive ground contamination throughout the Widow's Gap area. Soil samples revealed unusually high levels of phosphorus and calcium compounds consistent with the decomposition of large amounts of organic matter. The contamination pattern suggested that biological material had been buried throughout the area over an extended period, supporting the folklore accounts of numerous unmarked graves. The Geological Survey team's findings were far more extensive than anticipated, revealing contamination that spread across several acres of forest and penetrated to depths that suggested decades of accumulated biological material. Chemical analysis indicated that the contamination was not the result of normal animal decomposition or natural processes, but rather appeared to be the product of systematic disposal of processed organic matter over an extended period. More puzzling was the discovery of artificial cavities and tunnels beneath the forest floor, extending in multiple directions from the original Hathorne property site. These underground passages appeared to have been excavated by hand and showed evidence of sustained use over several years. The survey team's report noted that the extent and complexity of the subterranean network suggests a level of planning and labor that exceeds what one individual could reasonably accomplish. The tunnel system discovered by the Geological Survey extended far beyond anything that had been documented during the original investigation. Multiple levels of passages connected natural cave formations with artificial excavations, creating a network that spanned several miles, and included chambers that appeared to have been designed for specific purposes related to anatomical experimentation and body storage. The Geological Survey was discontinued without explanation after team members reported equipment malfunctions and unsettling discoveries within the tunnel system. The official report, classified upon completion, concluded that the area was unsuitable for any form of development or public use, and recommended that it remain permanently closed to human access. Despite these official restrictions, the Widow's Gap area continued to attract occasional visitors drawn by local folklore and the enduring mystery of the case. These unauthorized explorations invariably ended in disappointment or, in some cases, tragedy. Between 1970 and 1975, 3 separate incidents involved hikers or curiosity seekers who became lost in the area and required rescue by state emergency services. In each case, the lost individuals were found in a state of confusion and distress, reporting experiences of disorientation and claiming to have encountered structures that should not exist. The consistency of these reports across multiple unrelated incidents suggested that there might be physical remnants of Cordelia's activities that continued to affect visitors to the area. The most significant of these incidents occurred in 1974, when a group of urban explorers from Charleston attempted to locate and document the remains of the Hathorne house. The group, led by photographer Marcus Donovan, had planned a weekend expedition to create a photographic record of the site for a magazine article about West Virginia's dark history. Donovan's group was reported missing when they failed to return as scheduled. A search and rescue operation located them 4 days later, approximately 2 miles from their intended destination. All 3 members of the group were found in a severely dehydrated and psychologically traumatized state. Medical examination revealed no evidence of physical assault, but psychological evaluation indicated that they had experienced significant trauma. The group's photographic equipment was discovered scattered throughout the forest, with most of the cameras and film damaged beyond recovery. The few surviving photographs showed only images of forest vegetation and rock formations, with no evidence of any structures or archaeological remains. However, several of the images contained unusual visual artifacts that photographic experts were unable to explain, including geometric patterns that appeared to be burned into the film emulsion and shadow formations that seemed to move between sequential frames. Marcus Donovan, after his recovery, provided a fragmentary account of the group's experiences to investigators. According to his statement, they had become lost shortly after beginning their search for the Hathorn property, despite carrying detailed topographical maps and GPS equipment. "The landscape seemed to shift around us," he reported. "Landmarks we had passed an hour earlier would appear in different locations or wouldn't be there at all. Our instruments gave contradictory readings, and we began to find evidence of construction in places where our maps showed only virgin forest." Most disturbing was Donovan's claim that they had discovered what appeared to be freshly excavated earth and recently constructed wooden structures, despite the fact that the area had been abandoned for nearly 70 years. Someone or something was continuing the work that woman started, he insisted during his interview with state investigators. The digging was too precise and purposeful to be the result of natural processes or animal activity, and the sounds we heard at night, like someone working with hand tools, digging and hammering, but all was just beyond our ability to locate the source. The state investigation into the Donovan incident concluded that the group had suffered from a combination of exposure, dehydration, and psychological stress that had led to shared delusions. The official report dismissed their claims of finding evidence of recent activity as symptoms of their compromised mental state. However, several details from their account corresponded closely to historical descriptions of Cordelia Hathorn's methods and activities, despite the fact that Donovan and his companions had no knowledge of the sealed investigation records. Following the Donovan incident, state authorities implemented stricter access controls for the Widow's Gap area. Warning signs were posted at all known entry points, and regular patrols were established to discourage unauthorized exploration. These measures proved effective in reducing the number of incidents, though they could not eliminate the persistent folklore and speculation that continued to surround the case. The enduring mystery of Cordelia Hathorn and her hidden activities represents one of the most disturbing chapters in Appalachian criminal history. The combination of geographic isolation, methodical planning, and apparent psychological obsession created conditions that allowed her crimes to continue undetected for an extended period. The ultimate scope of her activities may never be fully known, given the destruction of key evidence and the continued restriction of access to the site. Perhaps most troubling is the suggestion, supported by various witness accounts and physical evidence, that Cordelia's work may have been inspired by or connected to broader networks of similar activity. References in her recovered journal fragments to corresponding practitioners and shared methodologies imply that she may not have been working in complete isolation. However, no evidence of such connections was ever definitively established, and the sealed nature of the investigation records makes further research virtually impossible. The psychological profile that emerges from the available evidence depicts Cordelia Hathorn as an individual driven by an obsession that transcended normal human boundaries. Her willingness to sacrifice not only others but ultimately herself in pursuit of her grotesque goals suggests a level of dedication that borders on the pathological. The methodical nature of her activities, combined with the sophisticated techniques she appeared to employ, indicates a level of knowledge and planning that required considerable time and resources to develop. The question of where and how Cordelia acquired the knowledge necessary to conduct her experiments remains unanswered. Her background as the wife of a timber merchant provided no obvious connection to medical or scientific training. Some investigators have speculated that she may have had access to anatomical texts or medical equipment through unknown channels, possibly connected to her late husband's business relationships or her own mysterious past before arriving in Braxton County. The geographic setting of the crimes played a crucial role in enabling Cordelia's activities to continue undetected. The isolation of Widow's Gap created ideal conditions for concealment, while the transient nature of her victims ensured that their disappearances went unnoticed. The acoustic properties of the location, which amplified sounds within the gap while concealing them from the outside world, may have contributed to the persistent reports of unusual noises that preceded the discovery of her activities. Modern criminologists studying the case have noted parallels to other historical instances of serial killing involving anatomical experimentation, though none of comparable scope or duration. The systematic nature of Cordelia's crimes, combined with the apparent scientific methodology she employed, places her case in a unique category within the annals of American criminal history. The lasting impact of the case extends beyond its immediate criminological significance. The restrictions placed on the Widow's Gap area have effectively preserved it as an archaeological site, though one that may never be fully investigated due to safety and legal concerns. The continued reports of unusual phenomena in the area, while officially dismissed, maintain the location's reputation as a place where normal explanations prove inadequate. Today, the area that once contained the Hathorne property remains closed to public access, designated as protected forest land, with access restricted for environmental and safety reasons. The official justification for these restrictions focuses on unstable geological conditions and environmental contamination, though local residents understand the true reasons for the continued prohibition. The legacy of Cordelia Hathorne serves as a reminder that even in an age of increasing connectivity and surveillance, there remain places where human evil can flourish unchecked. The isolation that enabled her crimes no longer exists in most parts of modern America, but the psychological and social conditions that create such individuals persist, requiring continued vigilance and understanding.